Welcome. We're going to make some bread. I haven't made bread in a little while actually, but we're going to make some medieval bread. Medieval Egyptian bread actually from the 14th century. Well, I say it's based on a recipe from the 14th century. It's from an Egyptian cookbook, which was quite a comprehensive cookbook, which the title of which was obviously in Arabic, but it translates as the treasure trove of benefits and variety at the table. And one of the chapters, the second chapter actually, has 10 different recipes for bread. And this recipe is actually, or this book is quite unique for its time, and then it actually mentions quantities. So we do have, you know, some quantities to work with rather than normally where you have to try and work it out. It is quite specific about the fact that it is white bread flour, or white flour should I say. We're going to use some white bread flour. I've got here 450 grams. I've got 150 mils of sesame oil, and I've got about 70 mils of warm water, which I put a tablespoon of sugar in, and I'm just going to add some yeast to. Now, we know that it must have had yeast because it specifically mentions leavened bread. It doesn't say yeast, it mentions leavened bread. Later in the book, in a different chapter, it talks about all these different leaveners. Is it leaveners? I suppose it is. Which are, it's just sort of like, it's obviously talking about yeast. It's talking about using effectively the yeast from beer, from having brewed ales. You remove that and you use that as the leavening agent. It talks about using dough from a previous batch. So essentially like a sourdough and that sort of thing. So the recipe that I got this from, they had got elected for sourdough. Well, I haven't got any, so I'm just going to make up a little, like I said, like I just showed you, yeast that way. Okay, but this bread isn't just bread. This bread has got pistachios and almonds and actually sesame seeds in it. So I've got my yeast on the go. I've told you the main ingredients. Next thing we're going to do is look at the nuts. So like I said, this recipe actually had quantities. It talked about using a pound of flour to 1/3 of sesame oil, so 1/3 of a pound of sesame oil, an ounce of sesame seeds, and a handful each of almonds and pistachios. So basically we've gone for 40 grams of sesame seeds, 40 grams of almonds and 40 grams of pistachios. So the first thing you need to do, whilst that yeast is you know, activating if you like, is to take these almonds and we just want to chop them up fairly finely. So I'm going to get my nuts chopped, okay, and then we should be ready to start making the dough. And once we've sort of got the dough sort of kneaded together, we will then knead into it the chopped nuts. So I'm going to get nut chopping. So that's my nuts chopped. So what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to tip my flour out onto there, and we're just going to make a little well into it, and I'm just going to start mixing in the oil. And once I've sort of got most of that oil blended in, you could, if you wanted, reduce the amount of oil and increase the amount of water. Okay, it really just depends on how heavy you like your bread, if you like. Now this bread will require a little bit of proving, a little bit of, well, obviously we want it to rise, and we're going to actually be making these into rolls. I think the original recipe actually talks about effectively dividing it up, this quantity, into about 4 rolls, but that's what we're doing anyway. And then they will be baked at a lowish temperature for bread. Okay, we're going to bake, can't even speak now. We're going to bake these in an oven, obviously, and at about 180. Okay, now you might quite often with bread do it a little bit hotter than that, but it does actually say in the recipe to do it in a cool oven and cook it through nice and slowly so that it doesn't burn, but it's not raw on the inside. Okay, so that's the oil almost all incorporated into it, and so I'm just going to try and gather this together a bit better, and then we'll mix in the yeast. And I don't know if you can see that in there, but that yeast now is nicely bubbling up. So let me just try and get this a little bit more ready for the yeast. So I'm going to tip all that nice bubbly. I can't bloody speak today, can I? It's only the afternoon, I ain't been drinking yet. That's the problem, and that's trying to escape there. So, like I say, we want to give this quite a good knead together, good mix together. And then it does actually say, I think it says in the recipe, where's it go? I'm just trying to read the recipe. Bread must be prepared with white wheat flour and kneaded for a long time. Although they don't actually specify how long a long time is. After leavening, so hence we know that it had yeast in it, it has to be cooked in the oven at low heat. And then they actually recommend that this particular bread you allow to cool before you eat it. So we're cooking this actually to have with a recipe later, not a medieval recipe. It's just thought that this might be quite a nice recipe. Now, if you find, like I say, they talk about sort of the quantities of oil to use and that, but they don't really mention the water. And if you find like this it's a little bit on the dry side, so it's obviously, you know, not a very good dough to knead, we'll just add a little bit more water. So I'm just going to try and make a little bit more of an actual cohesive lump, and then I will still add some water until it is more dough-like, and we can then incorporate our nuts. Get our nuts incorporated in the dough. So we've got a bit more of a pliable dough here, so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to flatten it out, and we're then just going to add our nuts. Like I say, they're roughly chopped, not too worried if they are a bit perhaps a bit coarse. It's all going to add to it. And so now all we're going to do is obviously knead that and try and get these nuts embedded throughout that dough, which to begin with obviously is going to make a bit of a mess until we can get them thoroughly mixed in. So just going to carry on kneading this through like this, making sure I've got them as mixed in as I can. And then all I'm going to do is I'm going to put them into that bowl, put the dough into that bowl and let it rest, and let it sort of hopefully, I was getting bloody nuts on the floor now, bloody wife will be after me. Just have had to clean room this week. She just done that floor, now look at the bloody mess she made. Can't win. So anyway, once we've let it rest for about 40 minutes, we'll come back, we'll make sure the oven's on at, like I say, 180, and we'll then divide it up into our rolls and get ready to bake it. So you can see, well, I don't know if I showed you how much was in there to begin with, but it's doubled in size. It's had about 40 minutes. So I'm just going to remove it from that, and what we're going to do is I'm just going to divide that up into 4, and we're just going to shape these into 4 sort of roll shapes. And then, like I say, the oven's been on preheating up to 180, and they're going to go into the oven for about 35 minutes, but I'm going to keep my eye on them because obviously their rolls are quite small. I'll just put a bit of parchment paper on there. Actually, I noticed also I made them slightly different sizes as well. So they're going to go into the oven for up to about 35 minutes. I'll keep my eye on them, and then when they're sort of done, you know, a little bit of a hollow tap underneath, we'll bring them out. And then like I said, the recipe, and also we're not going to eat them straight away anyway, the recipe says allow them to cool before you eat them. So I'll show you when they come out. So we're coming up to about 30 minutes, and I've checked on these rolls, so I think they're done. So let's have a look. So there you go. Yep, I think that's done. So you can see there, nicely browned. Look almost like they're wholemeal, which obviously they're not. So all I'm going to do now is I'm just going to put them onto the wire rack to cool, and then perhaps might split one later. Nicely toasted nut. So there is your medieval Egyptian bread rolls, or mini loaves if you like, with pistachio and almond, and actually sesame seeds. So we'll be enjoying them later.